Okay, welcome to this meeting and report back for the recent trade union delegation to Cairo, organised by MENA Solidarity. And obviously thanks to the NUJ London Magazine branch for hosting our meeting tonight as well. My name's Andy Lawson. I'm a branch secretary in the PCS Civil Service Union, and I was also part of the recent delegation to Cairo. Our first speaker is going to be Anne Alexander. Anne did a lot of the work in terms of facilitating the demonstration and doing a lot of the translations over there, which is very, very useful, obviously. And I'm a researcher at Cambridge, doing research into the Egyptian labour movement. She's going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a couple more speakers from the delegation, and then open it up. So I'll let Anne kick off.
Thank you. And yes, I should say I was organising the delegation rather than the demonstration.
Did I say demonstration?
I said demonstration.
Yeah. Apologies, force of habit.
I think the first thing I want to say about what we've got to talk about today is that this is, in a sense, the untold story of the Egyptian revolution, as far as what you see on the Western media. That this is about the revolution in the workplaces, in people's local areas, the things that people are doing in their daily lives. It's not about the big media events that dominated our TV screens in February, important as those were. And of course, without those huge events, without the millions of the streets, none of what we're going to talk about would have been happening. That this is a story about how the revolution's gone much deeper, how it's got into places and started opening up vistas for ways of workers organising themselves, for democracy, getting into places where we don't have it in this country. And it's also about understanding that this is a revolution, although it was something that was very... Democracy was at the heart of it. Democracy was in terms of the fight for constitutional freedoms, for the right to vote, for getting rid of the dictatorship. That actually, from the beginning, this has been a revolution with a very big social soul, and it's a revolution where that social soul is growing bigger by the day. That the millions of people who came into the streets in February to overthrow Mubarak, by and large, weren't the Google executives. They were there, they were at the front of the demonstrations, and in the media they were important, but the millions of people were very ordinary people. They were workers, they were poor people, they were people who maybe owned small shops, they were people who live on the margins in many cases. And they went into the streets and braved the tanks and the tear gas and did absolutely extraordinary and heroic things. And now the demands that they're raising, of wanting a better life for their children, of seeing that the right to vote means nothing without the right to a loaf of bread, is a very, very important fundamental part of this revolution. And that the courage that they found in terms of standing up to the state, they also turned that back into a courage to go back into their workplaces and stand up to their bosses. And that in doing this, there is a huge amount that we, as trade unionists and activists here in Britain and across the West, can learn from this movement. When we went on the delegation, we were constantly surprised by the way in which many of the people who were very welcoming to us, wanted to sit and talk to us, felt that we had something to teach them. I mean, we hoped that some of the stories that we exchanged and the experiences that we could share with them may have been useful, but really it was much more the other way. It was much more about learning from them, firstly about the kinds of organisations that they're building, about the way in which that they can teach us that ordinary people can change society from below. But also in terms of, as I said, the way that the Egyptian revolution has opened up the possibilities of seeing democracy get into places where we simply don't have it here. One of the most inspiring examples that we came across when we met people in Egypt was the story of the hospital workers in Manshaert al-Bakri Hospital. We met Mohammed Shafiq, who's a doctor in the hospital, who's one of the key activists who helped to set up the Manshaert al-Bakri Hospital Workers Union, which is a union that goes right from porters to doctors, and it covers practically everybody in the hospital. And it started off with him going from Tahrir Square back to the hospital and raising very concrete and practical demands about doctors' pay and doctors' conditions, and suddenly finding that this acted like a lightning rod to pull in the anger of people in the hospital who wanted to do something and wanted to change things for the better. That the independent union that they founded suddenly gathered vast majority of the workers in the hospital under its banner, and then found itself having to make decisions about, well, we could change the budget of the hospital, we could sort things out so that there would be less corruption, we could reallocate resources to make life better for patients, we could get rid of the manager who started standing in the way, the director of the hospital started standing in the way of some of these even quite small changes that they were trying to make. So they sacked him. The union council decided they were going to get rid of the manager, and they called him to a meeting and said, we have decided that we want to replace you. And now comes the really imaginative part. Instead of calling up the Ministry of Health and saying we need another manager, they said, well, we'll choose one ourselves. And they ran a democratic election to choose their new manager. Even down to the details of this, it's a fantastic story. They got the technicians from the hospital made their own ballot box, which had a glass front, so that there was, no danger of any kind of shady dealings with the ballots. They made special ballot papers, which included pictures of the candidates, because not all the workers who were going to vote could read and write. And around 500 of the hospital staff voted in this election and chose a manager for themselves, who then is a very different kind of manager to the managers that we're used to. Somebody who's actually has a degree of pressure on them from below and a degree of accountability to the workforce, which is just unthinkable in our own experiences here. And so then they rang up the Deputy Minister of Health and said, well, we've got a new manager for our hospital. And the Minister of Health was not very pleased with this. He apparently said, you can't elect your boss, you can't elect your father, you can't do this. And they turned around and said, well, sorry, otherwise, if you don't appoint him now, it's going to be the front page of every newspaper in Egypt tomorrow morning. And 2 hours later, a fax came through saying that the new manager had been duly appointed officially by the Minister of Health. And that was the end of the matter. Apart from, of course, it isn't the end of the matter, because then the struggle has to go on, because actually you can't solve the problems facing the health workers or the patients within the confines of a single hospital. So now the model is being replicated in other hospitals, a neighbouring hospital, Dua Hospital, which is in the same area, trying the same model, Qasr Al-Aini Hospital, as a new independent union being founded. And there's also been networking and organising at a national level, producing the first doctors' strike in Egypt. Some people say ever, certainly since the 1950s. And what's interesting about this is that it's not simply about the sectional demands of individual groups of workers, which is somehow how it's painted by the big businessmen and the politicians in Egypt, who like to say that this is just about individual workers wanting to grab things for themselves. I mean, we get this kind of language all the time. There's a great deal of heat and light coming out of the right-wing press against the RMT union at the moment over the dispute on the tubes and so on. But every time there's a strike in Egypt at the moment, more and more general demands keep getting put. So the doctor's strike wasn't just about doctors' pay and conditions. The doctor's strike was also about raising the health budget, about the rights for patients, about actually a very different kind of health service, something that was not about profit. Egypt has a huge problem in terms of health privatisation, where you have a two-tier system, a run-down public system and a private system which is about making money. If it sounds familiar, it sounds very familiar to us here in this country. And really that's the kind of spirit of the revolution, which I think is so important that we bring back here. It's about imagining beyond the struggles that we see, the bread and butter struggles for every day. Another one of my favourite demands, maximum wages. Forget minimum wages, maximum wages. In a large number of sectors of the Egyptian economy, there are really serious campaigns where people are trying to fight for a maximum wage within that sector, which is a very good way of pointing out that inequality is the heart of the problem, really, in terms of poverty. Bring down the wages of the people at the very top of society, and then you can do something about solving the problem of poverty at the bottom. Abolition of all temporary contracts. Again, you see this time and time again among lists of demands. And there are really serious and very successful struggles taking place. Large numbers of the strikes that take place are around making temporary workers permanent. And again, this breaks down the idea that we've often told that permanent workers and temporary workers can't fight together, that casualisation divides the workforce and makes us enemies. Those who are on temp contracts like myself are somehow, you know, enemies of those who are lucky enough to have a permanent contract. A lot of the strikes in Egypt at the moment have very successfully got groups of workers on temporary contracts to be taken on permanently. Another big one, we could learn a lot from here, renationalisation. Large parts of the Egyptian state industries are sold off over the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years. And in a number of places, workers, like for example the textile workers in Shabin al-Qom, insistently raising the demand for renationalisation, of saying, no, this is something that was stolen from the people, this is something that needs to come back and not to be hived off to private investors or run down in a kind of fire sale way to be sold off at the biggest profit. And so, I mean, these are the kind of stories I think that we need to repeat time and time again. We were immensely privileged when we went to Egypt to meet people who have played an incredibly courageous role in not only standing up to dictatorship, which they did, and it's something that we must never forget, that without that wave of strikes in the few days before Mubarak fell, I think it's unlikely that he would have fallen at all. It was people like the Cairo bus workers and the military production workers who went out on strike in those few days, the postal workers and the doctors who came into Tahrir Square in their thousands, really shifted the balance of forces against the state at that crucial moment. And we should do all we can in terms of supporting and acting in solidarity with their struggles. And that's really what the network that we've set up is about. It's about spreading the message of hope that comes out of the Egyptian revolution, of spreading the message that ordinary people can change the world, and making sure that when they are facing, when they have their successes, we shout about it, and when they're facing attack, as for example Ali Fatouh from the Cairo Bus Workers Union, who's going to go on trial charged with incitement to strike in a few weeks' time, that we also do what we can to show that we stand in solidarity with them. So thank you.